Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we start, I would like to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded right now and will be uploaded soon on our Instagram. So today we'll be discussing the annexation as a whole, as mentioned in our title. Just to give everyone a quick background information, Israel is promising to begin their seizure of large parts of the occupied West Bank on July 1st. They want to specifically annex the Jordan Valley and large illegal settlements of the West Bank. The Jordan Valley makes up 1/3 of the West Bank and has nearly 65,000 registered Palestinian residents, and the residents who live in the areas to be annexed will not become Israeli citizens. This is not only quote unquote annexation, this is plain on land theft. I hope this gives a quick summary of the topic we're discussing today, and I'm sure the speakers we have today will go further in depth on what this will mean for Palestinians.
And we have a very amazing list today with our panelists. We start with Dr. Sami Al-Arian. He is a prominent Palestinian political activist, human rights advocate, and a community leader. He is the director of the Center for Islamic Global Affairs and Public Affairs professor at Istanbul Sabahattin University. Following on, we have Dr. Sami Hermez, who is an assistant professor in residence of anthropology at Northwestern University in Qatar. His research focuses mainly on the everyday life of political violence in Lebanon, and his broader concerns include the study of social movements and human rights in the Arab world. Finally, we also have Maryam Al-Khater, who is a rising junior at Georgetown University in Qatar. She is majoring in international politics, and she will be minoring in history and offering her insight into this very critical topic today. So thank you for all the speakers for coming today. And just a quick note before starting, please share any questions throughout the webinar. Just any questions that come to you, please share them through the questions and answers tab. You will see it in the bar below, or by the raise hands option, and we will take questions at the end after all of our panelists are done speaking. And yeah, so let's start it.
Thank you very much, Bothaina, and thank you, Zain, for inviting me to this important webinar. And thank you, the Students for Justice in Palestine and at Georgetown University in Qatar, and for the other co-panelists. I will offer a few observations at the beginning on this issue, the implications of the Israeli annexation plan. We have obviously to understand the roots of the problem. The roots of the problem did not start 50 years ago, or Oslo, or even before that. It started actually late in the 19th century. That's when political Zionism and the Zionist project came into being. And came primarily because of the European racism, anti-Semitism that was taking place, even though after the Enlightenment era and the emancipation of Jewish communities across Europe, who suffered tremendously for centuries under basically Christian emperors and Christian societies, and they thought they were about to be emancipated. They now are equal citizens. They came out of their ghettos. But the founder of Zionism, who was a journalist by the name of Theodor Herzl, witnessed firsthand the racism, discrimination that was taking place when he was attending a trial of a Jewish French officer in French courts, in which he concluded that the only way for Jews to actually be free and independent and have self-determination is by embracing this Jewish nationalism. And that's where Zionism was born, late in the 19th century. And for the next 50 years, the Zionist movement started expanding throughout mainly Western Europe, even though Western Europe had less discrimination than, for example, Jewish communities in the eastern part, and particularly under Russian czars and so on and so forth. I don't have time to go through the history of Zionism, obviously, but we have to understand where the root of the problem is. It did not exist that somehow we have two nationalism inside Palestine and they were competing or contending. We had communities outside Palestine who were living there for centuries, and they were being discriminated against. And they thought that to solve their problem, they have to go and colonize and settle into someone else's land, which is Palestine. Actually, they didn't particularly choose Palestine, except for obviously the spiritual and the ability to gather many Jews in Palestine. They actually considered Uganda and other places, as historians will tell you. But there are many imperatives for Zionism to thrive and to keep its ability to bring the Jewish communities around the world into a situation where they can coalesce around this Zionist idea. Traditionally, we have two kinds of Zionism: the pragmatic ones, which was led by Ben-Gurion and his cohorts, who were leading actually Israel until about 1977, all the way before the state was founded in 48, all the way to 1977. And in 1977, we had the disciples of revisionist Zionism, who were calling for maximalist positions, uncompromising, not conceding an inch, but even in your face type, that this is our land, the triumphant type. And the descendants or disciples of Jabotinsky, such as Begin, Shamir, Sharon, and now Netanyahu, they have been leading that society in Palestine, in historical Palestine. And they had no intention whatsoever of making any kinds of concessions or compromises with the indigenous populations. Again, in one of my presentations that you may find online, particularly you may find it on our website at siga.org, I outlined 12 strategic imperatives of the survival of Zionism and the Jewish state and the Israeli state inside Palestine. And I don't have time to go over them, but it's very important to note at least some of them. And at the top is being an exclusivist state, meaning that Zionism from its beginning believed that it has to take as much of the land as possible with the least number of indigenous populations as possible, meaning the Palestinians. And that the second one is exclusion. That is, as they invite other Jewish communities, Jews around the world, into Palestine, giving them full citizenship, they looked at Palestinians as being totally excluded. So after they expelled over half of the population from Palestine in 1948, the right of return, that is, they were denied completely, coming back and being, even according to international law, having the ability to go back in their homes, including their descendants. Also, part of these imperatives is the gradual expansion of the state. They couldn't take it all at once, so it was taken over time. And that is done with another imperative, which I call creating facts on the ground. And part of this facts on the ground is what's been taking place in Palestine since the Oslo Accords of 1993, because of the Intifada, the resistance, and because of some public pressure, opinion pressure in the aftermath of the Gulf War in 1991. Israel started this process of trying to apply its strategic plan by only recognizing the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, and then actually taking that step without any meaningful concessions, and creating an alternative, which they call the Palestinian Authority, whose main function has been to make sure that it protects the occupation and makes it basically occupation free, cost free, meaning not much to that. Since that time, none of the so-called final status issues have been resolved. The whole premise of Oslo was that in 5 years, that there were about 5 major issues that would have to be negotiated, even though the Palestinians have given their historical compromise. And by that, I don't mean the Palestinian people, because this was never put into a referendum to the Palestinian people, but the leadership of the PLO at the time recognized Israel on 78% of historical Palestine. In return, they thought, for the remaining 21.5%, meaning Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza being about 3.5%, and the West Bank is about 18% of historical Palestine. But of course, none of these final status issues were resolved because they were determined. The Zionists were determined whether because both strands of Zionism really don't differ on the end goal, they differ on tactics and theatrics. So when we come to that, obviously in 93, the accords were signed in 94, the final status issues should have been determined by 1999, and today we're in 2020, and none of them have been. And actually the Zionists have moved on, meaning Netanyahu, by never actually, and that was unfortunately not part of the accords, adhering to any of the spirit, let alone of the text of the agreements. So we ended up with going from 125,000 settlers in Palestine when Oslo was finalized, into today over 750,000, almost 6 times. And of course, they were always waiting for the right moment, or what they call the historical opportunity. And they think in the person of Trump, they were able to find this historical opportunity, and that's why this is happening now. Now, but one of the imperatives also of the survival of the Zionist colonial settler state in Palestine is to always rely on a great power. That happened gradually, from Britain at the beginning during the mandate, and then going into Germany and France for economic compensation and military hardware. And of course, finally, since 1973, depending totally on the US as the greatest power in the world. So what we have is they were waiting for that moment. They could care less about what the other world powers or the international community says. Sometimes they try to address these issues, simply by giving concessions that are not deep, but primarily they cater to the United States. And in the person of Trump, someone who doesn't really care much about.
So Dr. Sami Al-Arian, you're muted.
All along, I was muted?
No, just for a bit right now.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, I thought that would have been strange. Okay, all right. So, so when we talk about the dependence of Israel on the United States, we're talking about providing them with 3.7 to sometimes even $10 billion as in the loan guarantees. Annually, they have been provided by over $130 billion. Some people even say $150 billion since 1973. The shield, the political and diplomatic shield, 45 vetoes. So far, the largest number of vetoes that have been cast on behalf of any country in the world has been the US for Israel. And now we have, at least there was a semblance that, United States is trying to become or to act as an honest broker. And there is no even that appearance. Trump doesn't even appear to become a broker, let alone an honest broker. He just adopted the maximalist positions of Israel into so-called the Trump plan. So he removed all the final status issues. He removed Jerusalem by declaring Jerusalem as the state, as the capital of the state of Israel. He removed the right of return by declaring that there are no refugees and cutting off all aid to UNRWA. He removed the settlements issue by recognizing them. He recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights, so there is no need to negotiate with any other partner. And of course, on the territory part, he approved, or at least gave Israel 30% of the West Bank, but actually this 30% is not true. It's about 40% to be exact, because about 10%, these are cooked up, these are phony, fake figures that they give. It's about 40% of the West Bank. That includes the Jordan Valley and the major settlement blocks and the most fertile land, as well as the water wells, the aquifers. So when we look at this, what we end up, and I hope at one point we will share a map, and perhaps even Sami can show us that map, what you would see is not really a state. I mean, that's the death of the major implication is this facade of having some kind of a negotiations between two equal partners, which were never really equal, is dead. There's no more two-state solutions in the offing. People have been saying that for years. We said it 20 years ago, but now everybody is there to see. There is no this facade that somehow there will be two states and that they will be negotiating some kind of land swaps. That is it's never going to happen. What we have today is the trappings of, or the actual structure of an apartheid regime. Now, Israel had, since 1993 at least, and perhaps even earlier, the choices. I mean, they had being Jewish, being democratic, and having the land. There are three things that have been at the heart of the Palestinian or the Israeli project. And they had to choose 2 out of 3. Had they chosen being Jewish and democracy, that would have been translating into what is called the 2-state solution, meaning that they get 78% of historical Palestine, even though that is neither just nor right. But that would have been what the compromise, so to speak. Or they could have chosen the land, meaning that there will be no division. The whole land will be for the people, both nationals, both people, and maintaining some kind of a democratic structure. And when I talk about democracy, we're talking about citizen participation, equality, political tolerance, accountability, transparency, regular and free and fair elections, economic opportunity to all, and so on, and Bill of Rights, so on and so forth. These are the type of democracy. But what Israel actually has chosen throughout the negotiation process is that it wanted to maintain its Jewish domination and the land without any care about democracy. And if there is a democracy, it will just be a Jewish democracy, meaning you have now an apartheid regime. So the choice of Israel has been to bring about an apartheid regime inside Palestine. And to do that, they had to maintain several strategies. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I don't want to take over. Let me know, if I'm 3 minutes within my time, so I can conclude. So what they wanted, they created, or they have strategies to deal with keeping the Palestinians weak and dominated. So with the structure of Oslo, they created this Palestinian Authority that is nothing but a compliant authority that is dictated to by Israel, that created a security structure to protect Israel. So basically, it's a minimal cost occupation and trying to thwart any kind of resistance, including all kinds of peaceful resistance. It created in Gaza under siege a Hamas authority that somehow Hamas got into becoming a ruling authority where resistance became second to trying to maintain peace and to maintain some kind of living conditions for the people. So it's no longer a resistance movement first, but it became resistance movement second, because now it's the ruling authority in Gaza, which took a lot from its ability to resist the occupation. And then you have different strategies for the Palestinians in the diaspora, whether they are under Arab dominations, with having all these policies that keep them down and poor and destitute and unable to live in dignity, or the Palestinians outside by having them always on the defensive and having these kind of laws that will strap them financially and keep them weak, as we have seen in the many BDS and other laws in the United States and so on and so forth. So these strategies was being to divide the Palestinians, and not even to speak about the different discrimination and racist policies for Palestinians inside the 1948 areas. Within the region itself, what we have here is that, especially since the 2011 Arab Spring or the uprisings, what we have here is that we have 3 different powers within the region, broadly speaking. You have those who are counter-revolutionary. They are counter any kind of a democratic transition or a democratic popular movements that will come at the forefront, trying to implement or tries to democratize society and try to move it up by having these regimes, whether they are controlled by the military regimes or whether they are corrupt and authoritarian regimes. Israel has been leading this path, supporting it, bringing it international cover and support, whether from the United States or the different financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank and so on and so forth, in order to maintain the weakness and the division of the Arabs. And that has been successful since 2013. And at the same time, you have the second strand of these popular movements who are trying to break through these authoritarian and corrupt regimes and bring about democratic changes. And they have been obviously now on the defensive for many years. And they have been supported with some regional countries such as Turkey and to some extent Qatar. But also you have the third ones who bring resistance at the forefront of their confrontation, not particularly concerned about democratic reforms, such as some of these resistance movements, Hezbollah, Hamas, Jihad, and so on and so forth, and of course Iran. So now we have realignment within the region. So we have Israel and, let's say, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and so on and so forth, who are trying to maintain this status quo. And to them, Palestine is no longer a great issue, because they have to align themselves with Israel, meaning that the Palestinians would have to pay the price. And that's why now this is happening, annexation. It's a historical opportunity for the right, because we don't have a right and left in Israel. We have right, we have a right, and we have an extreme right, and they negotiate with each other rather than having any kind of right, center, and left. So they have been leading, and they think this is a historical moment in which the international situation, especially within this health crisis, this pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, that they can take this opportunity and annex the land. That's how Netanyahu thinks, that he wants to do the big things, and he also always referring actually to Ben-Gurion as being the one who did the big things, meaning that they're taking the land of 48, and he thinks now he can be the king of Israel, who brought about greater Israel. And of course, he's been saying that for many years. So the international opportunity, Trump may not last beyond November or January, when, if a new president is inaugurated, you have the word occupied, you have Russia basically being busy with other strategic and geopolitical considerations in Syria and Crimea and so on and so forth, and he's trying to make some deals with them. You have China obviously also occupied, and it's not in the position now to expand or take bold decisions. And of course, you have the region where the upper hand so far has been with the counter-revolutionary forces against those democratic or the resistance forces. So this to them is a historic opportunity, even though a lot of their friends, especially on the other side of Zionism, think that it has many risks for them, including that you have a strong solidarity movement around the world. You have a realignment even within the political body in the United States, where the Democrats now, or at least within the Democratic Party, and those who are outside, who are basically progressives, have changed tremendously after this alignment between the right in Israel and the Republican Party, that there are many, many risks involved, that this is not a cost-free annexation plan if it takes place. Now they have three options, of course, and either Netanyahu could and his alliance could choose one of the three. They could have full annexation, which is basically what Trump has given in his plan, which is about, I would say 40%. They say 30%, but I think it's more than that, because they do not count Jerusalem and they do not count much of the borders inside the barrier wall. So it makes it about 40% of the West Bank. There's nothing really to negotiate about, which create basically Palestinian cantons. It's pretty similar, reminiscent of the South African apartheid regime. We don't have any contiguous states. If you go to Kushner's plan, the Trump-Netanyahu plan, what you see is bridges and tunnels and all kinds of trickeries taking place there in order to give it the semblance of a state. Even the right in Israel, they don't call it state. They never called it a state. They said, Netanyahu said, if they want to call it a state, they can call it a state, but it has no all the conditions of having a state with a sovereignty and borders, contiguous borders, and currency and all that. That doesn't exist. So it's not really a state by any stretch of the imagination. And then when you look at yes.
I'm so sorry to cut you in, Dr. Al-Arian. We'd all really love to have your
How many minutes do I have?
Continue on.
I can
unfortunately, we ran out of time.
Sure, 1 minute.
Sure, please go ahead.
All right. So when we talk about this, we have to also mention that even this is a historical opportunity, that they have three options: full annexation, as I said, or partial annexation, which was basically the settlements close to the wall, or a symbolic annexation because of the friction that might take place between them and other great powers, and also not knowing if Trump would win. So it comes in both ends, which could be a symbolic one by getting the Ariel settlement block and the Adal Dominion. Whatever it is, they're trying to always put facts on the ground and force the Palestinians into accepting them, which has been part of this. So let me conclude by saying there are also opportunities here. That this facade of having a negotiated settlement is no longer on the table. Everybody recognizes this. No one can hide behind that somehow we're going to have a two-state solution. That is dead. So the world is faced now with accepting an apartheid state in Palestine, or working hard in trying to dismantle this racist project, which I would call that this is the ultimate goal for us, is to dismantle all Zionist institutions. That doesn't mean, I want to emphasize this, dealing with the Jewish population in a way that will be anti-Semitic or harm them. This is simply ending the regime so that you can have equality, you can have democracy, you can have all the meanings of having equal citizenry in one land. And if that doesn't happen, it's not just particularly one state, because people can debate that. But the root of the problem has been Zionism and its racist tendencies towards the indigenous population. That has to go. There is no other way. But that's going to take struggle, and we have a lot of allies in the international solidarity movement. There's a lot of tactics, and I'm sure Sami will talk about BDS and its successes and so on and so forth. And I believe that is the road ahead. Whatever happens now, there are some blessings in disguise, because now no one can, in straight face, trying to argue that somehow we have some kind of negotiated settlement. And finally, the Palestinians themselves, they have to face up to this reality, and particularly within the Palestinian Authority, I believe they have to dissolve themselves and go back to the strategy of pure resistance against this occupation for it to go away. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you everybody. Thank you, Dr. Al-Arian, for those comments, and I was happy actually to hear all that you said and how you began and taking us back also a little bit into the history. Thank you to Zain and Bothaina and Students for Justice in Palestine for the invitation. So really what I wanted to do is say a few words about the annexation itself and about Area C to basically move us and move us along to complement what was just said, and then I'm going to talk quickly or try say a few remarks on what we can do and what is being done. So annexation, first of all, is the acquisition of territory through force. It is a crime under international law, and it solidifies the rule of the powerful, the rule of force, the rule of violence, not the rule of law and justice. This is not the first annexation. Jerusalem was annexed, I think, in 1980, and the Golan Heights was annexed in 1982. And of course, you have the largest annexation in 1948. Even beyond what was allocated to Israel by the United Nations in 1947. So recently, 47 UN experts who were appointed by the Human Rights Council have said that the morning after annexation would see the crystallization of an already unjust reality. Two peoples living in the same space, ruled by the same state, but with profoundly unequal rights. And this is a vision of a 21st century apartheid. Of course, Israeli apartheid is not new either. It is enshrined in Israel's existence. There are over 20 laws, and I'm probably undercounting, that govern the Palestinian citizens of Israel differently from its Jewish citizens. So besides those Palestinians who are ruled in the West Bank by a different set of laws than Jewish settlers in the West Bank, you also have laws that govern Palestinian citizens of Israel differently from Jewish citizens of Israel. The most fundamental of these is Israel's citizenship law, which grants superior citizenship to Jewish nationals over other nationals and allows for the return of Jews, but not Palestinians. These apartheid laws extend into land ownership, marriage, and other facets of daily life. So what the annexation of parts of Area C will do is formally fold the people in that part of the land under these Israeli laws, right? So while in some ways it's informal, they're governed by a sort of military administration. Now they will be governed by Israeli law. So I have to say, though, that annexation, much is similar to what has been previously said, is the logical conclusion of decades of US policy, of European policy, of Israeli policy, and of the cowering of Arab governments. It is the culmination of decades of the international community allowing Israel to act with impunity, allowing Israel to colonize as it pleases. Annexation is also essentially the logical conclusion of the Oslo peace process that began in 1993. Edward Said was one of the first to lash out against this peace process, recognizing 27 years ago that it would lead to more oppression rather than peace. And he wrote, "Israel is certainly pleased that it can take the credit for having made peace and at the same time continue the occupation with Palestinian consent." And I think that's some of what Dr. Al-Arian was talking about, with also the putting in place a Palestinian authority that was sort of governing the occupation. Back then, it might have sounded less urgent maybe, or even like a conspiracy, but indeed, in the last 3 decades, at least at the state and government level, these decades have solidified Israel's role as a peacemaker without a Palestinian partner. Oslo changed the way the world viewed Israel. If Palestinians could make peace, surely foreign companies could engage with Israel. And so, for example, post-1993, post the Accords, you saw an influx of business into Israel. Companies that had previously stayed away were now flocking to Israel. Oslo was good for business, Israeli business, and with a few Palestinian elites also benefiting. Oslo also solidified a discourse that this was an equal conflict between two people seeking two states. The occupation became the only lens by which to understand the question of Palestine, or at least this was the intention. And it worked for many of us. It worked for many Palestinians too, who adopted a colonized mindset that normalized Israel and tried to negotiate with it and make the argument that if only we could change this or that law, or if only we could dismantle this or that checkpoint, things might be better. But many other Palestinians refused. They refused to fall in the night. They refused to accept to be seen only through the lens of occupation. And they resisted. And today, what annexation will reconfirm is what they've been trying to say for decades, that Israel is not only an occupying state, it's an apartheid state, it's a settler colony, a settler colonial state. And I think this is what we really need to keep in mind, what Palestinians have been trying to tell us for decades, and what many in the world have just dismissed as occupation. So I want, Zain, if you could just show the map while I talk. So annexation will add one new chapter to Israel's apartheid system. As some of you know, the Oslo agreements divided, wait, let me just, because it, 1 second, how do I, sorry. So Oslo basically divided the West Bank into 3 separate areas: Area A, Area B, and Area C. And so what you'll see is in the green, and this map is a bit simplified, but the green is Area A and B. So it's not, so Area A is more or less autonomous, fully autonomous, but Israelis can go in and out, the military. Area B is jointly administered. So the green parts is not all Area A, it's A and B in this map. And Area C, which is what is more important for today's discussion, it was always designated as under full control of Israel. And that is what in this map you'll see as the light blue and the orange. Okay, that is Area C. So Area C comprised 60% of the West Bank, and it's always been under Israeli control. Annexation would just formalize this. It would do little to change the reality. The most significant thing it might do is that it would cause a faster paced development of settlements, because now they would go through a different legal mechanism for approvals of the settlements and so on. The other two things are that it you know, the Palestinians are now fully encircled, but who's kidding is that, you know, they've always been encircled. And that also they will have less access to the most fertile parts of the West Bank. So what Israel plans to annex is approximately 30 to 40% of the West Bank, and basically 60% of Area C, not 100%. So you see that's why the difference between the light blue and the orange, right? So the light blue and orange is 100% of Area C. They're taking the orange, which is 60% of Area C. And this will allow it to extend its sovereignty to almost all of the Jordan Valley, except for Jericho. So you see Jericho there is cut off in green in the orange parts. They will take 235 illegal settlements and outposts. Those are the red in the picture. And they will, and that's around 325,000 settlers. The annexed land, I believe, will contain around 60,000 Palestinians. So there are between 180,000 to 300,000 Palestinians that count Area C as home. But I think, from what I understand, is that some of those will be in Jericho, and you know, so they won't be in. So not everyone in Area C. Sorry about that. So some of the Area C people are in the light blue, right? So they won't be counted as part of the annexed territory. So what you'll see is anyone living in the orange space of Area C are going to be targeted for this annexation. But Area C is already restricted to Palestinians, right? Israel has blocked Palestinian development by designating large swaths of land as state land, survey land, firing zones, natural reserves, and national parks, by allocating land to settlements, and other prohibitions. And interestingly, natural reserves and national parks. So what it does is, through greenwashing, basically using green policies, environmental policies, saying, you know, we are concerned about the land and the environment, we're going to dispossess Palestinians from their land, right? So there's this way of using this kind of modern day environmental rights language to dispossess. So it's already impossible to do pretty much anything in Area C. And now you have this annexation. So I think just, you know, keep in mind the difference. So what we are talking about when we're talking about the annexation. So finally, I want to move to what we can do, because a lot of this is just, you know, talk, and it's important to understand, but we also need to act, and we need to fight harder and follow the lead of Palestinian civil society, which among several things has called for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And this is one of the largest global campaigns for Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality. So I think one thing we need to think about is how does one push for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions in their local context? If we're speaking, and I noticed a lot of participants might be living in Qatar. So, you know, what does that mean from a context in Qatar, from context in some of our countries that are outside Europe and the US, which is where most of the active boycotts and divestments and sanctions are sort of happening, or the campaigns are happening. So one thing that Palestinian civil society just this month released were a set of actions that they want the world to take in response to annexation. And that is to ban arms trade and military security cooperation with Israel, suspend free trade agreements with Israel, prohibit all trade with the illegal Israeli settlements and ensure that companies refrain from, terminate business with Israel's illegal settlement enterprise, and ensure that individuals and corporate actors responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the context of Israel's regime of illegal occupation and apartheid are brought to justice. You can find these at Al-Haq's website, alhaq.org. These, again, I think when I look at these, they're targeted to mostly Western countries. So specifically for those of us in Qatar and the Arab world, what can we do? We have a lot of work to do, and so what can we do? A lot of our role has been reduced to sort of fluffy words, right? We condemn this, we reject this, and we stand with our brothers and sisters in Palestine, and we, give to charity. And that's where it stops, and we can see that in a sort of defunct Arab League, right, that just releases condemnations, but then countries are normalizing left and right. So I have six points I'll go over quickly. First, in the Arab world, we need to think of anti-normalization, think of not normalizing relations with Israel, and how to combat this push to normalize relations with Israel, to see Israel as a normal country, just like any other country. What's important is that, in Qatar, there's a lot of, especially sports normalization that is going on. And one can understand Qatar's position, trying to be a destination for global sports, but can we use this position to head a coalition advocating for the removal of Israel from sports bodies, for example? Every sport has rules about countries committing human rights violations, or the sports that's internally practicing racism in its, the clubs practicing internal racism. And Israeli football is racist. It prevents Palestinians from playing freely, from allowing Palestinian clubs to develop. It shoots football players in the knees and maiming them. So we need to think about how to combat this wave of normalization. Sports, diplomatically, culturally, we've seen a lot of reports that this is happening in Saudi Arabia, and I'm not really concerned so much with Saudi Arabia because I can't do anything there. But how do we combat this? Another thing is, we in Qatar, I don't know about Georgetown, but we employ G4S security, right, around the country, and G4S trains Israeli police, supplies smart surveillance cameras in Al-Aqsa Mosque. It supplies equipment and services to Israeli checkpoints and illegal settlements. So we can campaign to have contracts with G4S broken or not renewed. Right? These are sort of tangible things that we could do. We could raise our voices against other forms of normalizations. For example, Al Jazeera, especially in Arabic, has for decades brought on Israeli voices, especially spokespeople, to Arab TV screens to basically normalize these positions, that these are somehow legitimate perspectives that we need to listen to, as if we can't listen to them, we don't get them from all kinds of places. And so Palestinians have called on Jazeera to stop bringing Israeli spokespeople on the show, and stop promoting these views. And I think this has to do, I teach at Northwestern, so this has to do with questions of media objectivity and thinking about how media objectivity actually ends up being oftentimes complicit with the oppressor, and what that media objectivity actually means, and is that the value that we're seeking, and what does that mean when we're promoting certain types of voices? So instead of these kind of brotherly and sisterly solidarities, we have to think about not platforming Zionist views, right? So for example, a couple of years ago, Alan Dershowitz was speaking, in fact, at NUQ, and there were some beautiful protests that took place, and students went and took the risk and protested. But I would say that when we are reduced to debating whether we should attend and challenge someone like him or not attend at all, they've already won, right? When those are our choices, they've already won. Two quick other things is, in our approach, we need to be intersectional, amplifying other oppressed voices, and think about the liberation of all oppressed people and not just think insular. This means that, for example, in our current moment, that we can't be for Black lives and not fight for the rights of Palestinians. But equally, you cannot fight for Palestinian rights and be a racist who promotes anti-Blackness. So we are not liberated until every last one of us is liberated. And this also means that we have to fight and work harder to educate the racists amongst us. And you have, for example, in the US, you have situations where like Netflix, for example, plays tribute to Black Lives Matter, but then is silent on a show like Fawda, which is, again, normalizing a particular Israeli view. And Palestinians are calling for a removal of that show, but they don't do anything about that. And that, to me, suggests that Netflix is, in a way, exploiting Black lives for profit, but then, not being very consistently ethical. So it's amazing what they're doing on one hand, but we need to hold them to be ethical. And finally, and Dr. Al-Arian brought this up, but in a sense, we need to advocate for a just one-state solution. Right? Israel has effectively created one state on which it practices total sovereignty under apartheid. What we need to advocate for is one democratic state where all are equal, where all Palestinian rights, including the right of return, are preserved, and a state in which Palestinians have the right of self-determination. A state where settler colonialism, its structures and mindset are dismantled and seen in similar toxic and violent ways as we see the legacy of slavery, for example. So we must continue to fight for all that is good in the world. We must continue to fight out of love. And I want to leave you with the words of a Palestinian Fida'i, a fighter whose eyes I can still see through a TV screen, who once said, "Love is our motive, not hatred. That's why we shall win." Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. I hope you're all doing great. Thank you so much for including me in this webinar. My focus is more on international law and US foreign policy, so I'll be offering my insight on that. And I think Dr. Al-Arian and Dr. Hermez summed up the situation pretty well, so I'll be echoing some of that, and I'll just keep it short. So the Middle East plan presented by President Donald Trump on January 28, 2020, written by Jared Kushner, his son-in-law and senior advisor, is lacking in multiple aspects and highlights the forever existing notes of colonialism in the Middle East. And not only is the voices of Palestinian state members not present in the development of the plan, which more than proves that this plan does not meet Palestinian interests whatsoever. And, it doesn't try to begin with. The Peace to Prosperity plan does nothing to address the many crimes committed by the Israeli state since 1948 and only foreshadows more violations of international law and human rights. Before I get to the Middle East plan, what it means for Palestinians and overall international law, I believe it is important to give American-Israeli relations context to fully understand how this plan satisfies the interests of Israelis and disregards Palestinians. To start, American relations with the Israeli state and intervention when it comes to the Palestinian and Israeli conflict was not one that started all the way back in 1948 with the establishment of the Israeli state, but it started off quite rocky considering that Israel had some support with the Soviet Union and it was distributing oil trade between, it was disturbing oil trade between Arabs and Americans. And it was not until Israel's victory during the Six-Day War of the 1960s against the Soviet-backed Arabs that the US saw Israel as a strategic alliance. But that did not mean it supported what was happening domestically. And to further highlight American consensus on Israeli settlements, many US presidents have stated their stance in opposition to the settlements, since President Lyndon B. Johnson, Ronald Reagan, for example, deemed the occupation of the West Bank by Israelis as illegal. President George W.H. Bush was against it, and so was President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush. And although President Barack Obama was never really vocal about the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, under his administration, called the settlements illegal. That is not to say that the US has been in support of the Palestinian cause, but to show that the US has always recognized the power of international law and its significance. It was not until President Trump where the US fully aligned itself against the Palestinians by deeming the settlements as legal in the November of last year, which was a strange move since for so long US foreign policy has gone against that idea. Sorry, yeah, I muted myself, sorry. I just want to speak more about where Israel stands in the context of international law, considering that it has a history of violations that have not been investigated until 2012, when Palestine joined the United Nations as a non-member observer state. Years and years after, pro-Israeli lobbyists have been trying to push for the US and many other UN countries to deny it entry, with the US vetoing criticisms of Israeli illegal activity over 40 times. Israeli settlements and occupations of Palestinian land has been happening since 1918, after the Balfour Declaration of 1917, where the former Prime Minister of the UK, James Balfour, established Palestine as a national home of the Jewish people in response to the rise of Jewish nationalism or Zionism in Europe, and concerns over communism in the Soviet Union supported by Russian Jewish wealthy communities. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states that, quote, "The occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies," unquote. And it also prohibits the, quote, "individual or mass forced transfers as well as deportation of protected persons from occupied territory," unquote, which is what has been happening for the establishment of the Israeli state, with about 400,000 European settlers moving into Palestine. And of course, those numbers have increased tremendously since the establishment of the state, with only about 20% of the land left for Palestinians today. And to further emphasize the extent of crimes committed by Israelis, the word occupier and occupied lands insinuates that the establishment and use of property is temporary, as the Hague Regulations of 1907 showcase, but that is not the reality of the Israeli state, which proves that it is in breach of international law, which it agreed to the second it joined the United Nations in 1949. So there already was a peace plan and a so-called two-state solution that is still put in place, yet completely neglected by the Israeli state. And I'm referring to the Oslo Accords of 1993. The Oslo Accords were broken the minute they were signed. In 1994, an Israeli settler in the West Bank massacred Palestinians, and in 1995, the Israeli Prime Minister was assassinated by an Israeli who was opposed to the accords, showing that there were domestic tensions and major opposition. And the current prime minister is in great opposition of the accords, which is why he won the election in 1996. This shows that coexisting and peace were never the intention of Israeli settlers. So what makes us think that this particular peace to prosperity plan, or deal of the century, as President Trump puts it, is any different and is not indeed a sugar-coated way of committing ethnic cleansing? And in addition to that, when Palestine joined the United Nations in 2012, it quickly turned to the International Criminal Court to request that the court investigates the many crimes committed on Palestinian territories. Even in 2004, the International Court of Justice agreed that Israeli settlements of the West Bank and of East Jerusalem are illegal. And one thing that supports what I have stated earlier regarding the role and power of international law is that the Middle East plan calls for Palestine to drop all legal complaints made towards Israel and the United States in front of the ICC and the ICJ and all other legal tribunals. If the deal of the century would go through without the agreement of the Palestinians and without major adjustments to the plan, it would violate international law on the grounds of war crimes, considering that it would mean the movement of Israeli citizens into the West Bank, as if that was not already the case, and the seizing and destruction of property. Adding on to that, the Middle East plan does not go into the current refugee crisis that came about due to the forced removal of Palestinians from their land, with over approximately 5 million refugees currently displaced. It only hints at a compensation mechanism, but the only way to compensate for the loss of one's land is simply to give back the land. Not only is the plan going to legitimize the many crimes against humanity and war crimes that were already committed by Israel against Palestine, but it would also give a green light to many international actors to neglect international law, which of course is already a big issue. So thank you so much, and I hope I did the issue some justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maryam, and thank you, Dr. Arian and Dr. Hermez. Really, it's been amazing so far. So we'll go on now for the questions. We already have a few questions in the Q&A tab. We can also take questions by raising, you can raise your hand and we'll allow you to speak if you want to speak out your question. But for now, we'll start taking our first question. I have one question here from Haidar. The Israeli government has already stated that they will not be giving citizenship to the annexed Palestinians, leaving not only de facto, but the de jure stateless. For all the panel, what does the statelessness look like? And how does the day-to-day change for the average Palestinian?
Who is this addressed to?
Just to anyone, whoever wants to take the question.
Okay. I mean, there's no change, actually. I mean, it's the amazing thing about this is that the status quo, they have been able to maintain the status quo with the semblance that there is somehow a negotiated process taking place, which hasn't for years. And what we have here is an apartheid system. What this is doing, the annexation plan, is that it's putting that structure into official way. So the world has to confront it and to say, and they are gambling that somehow the world is going to accept it. And that's the big risk that many of Zionists have been warning against. Is there a cost-benefit analysis here that's been done, or is this just an emotional and political issue that Netanyahu is embarking upon? But in terms of what's going to happen to the Palestinians themselves, it's just going to put that structure that has been in place now for over half century into more an official way. You have two systems. You have a military governor, a military official in charge of making and executing policies in the West Bank. And you have a civilian system that all the settlers who are occupying Palestinian land and living in settlements illegally are being subjected to, like any other Israeli citizen. So there will be no kind of change for that status for Palestinians inside the West Bank. They will still be under occupation. They will still be subject to military rules and military jurisdiction. They will still have to have all the trappings of military occupation.
I would just add to that they would basically, I think what would, one, that they would probably keep the same status as what the other Palestinians in the West Bank currently have in terms of passport and so on. But what would change is effectively they would be, Israel would be in violation of another law in the sense that they're annexed this territory, but they haven't applied the same laws to all the people in the annexed territory. But they've been so good at subverting these laws, but effectively nothing would change.
Okay, thank you for your answers. We'll take another one from Timur. He's asking, during these complicated times, what do you think the Palestinian government should do specifically? And I would like to add to it Awad's question, where he's asking, amid the absence of any real consequence of Israel's unlawful actions, is international law still a viable tool for resistance? Can international law liberate? So a question of what can we do then? What can the government do?
Well, in the first question regarding the Palestinian Authority and the so-called Palestinian government, clearly we don't really have a Palestinian government, as in a sovereign way. It's really just a show. What you have here is Palestinian compliant to Israel dictates authority that is basically implementing what Israel wants in terms of its policies and to protect Israel, and most particularly the so-called security coordination to make sure that resistance will never be resumed against the occupation. So in that context, then this Palestinian Authority has been working against Palestinian interests, even though it has been the conduit, it has been the vessel by which Israel is implementing its policies. And the tragedy here is that you have few thousands of people who are part of this structure who are benefiting from the occupation through VIPs, through other financial compensation, through contract, and so on and so forth. These people are benefiting, and therefore for them to give up that authority, they will be giving up their privileges. So they pitted the interest of few thousands against the millions of Palestinians who live under occupation. But so in my view, that the best way for this to happen is that they need to dissolve this Palestinian Authority and put it back and let the people know exactly what they are, what the situation is, which is an occupying authority. And they put it back into the hands of the occupiers, and then let the people start resisting by all means. I mean, the people, the Palestinian people have been resisting for over a century, and they have used all kinds of strategies to do that. And certainly they are not devoid of restarting a third intifada, a massive uprising and rejection of the occupation. But as long as we have this authority in place, which is preventing this to take place, and as long as the United States and other European countries are financing this security structure that is preventing the Palestinians, or at least containing this Palestinian resistance, Israel is enjoying this occupation free or control-free occupation. That's one thing that needs to be done. On the other hand, we've had the Palestine Liberation Organization since 1964, where its charter, region's charter came before, and its existence, and it was born before the 1967 war. Meaning that there was a Palestinian case and issues that haven't been resolved even before the 67 occupation, including the right of return. We need to go back at least to the structure where there is a liberation movement. not a movement that's trying to negotiate how it will be dominated. And that's basically what's been taking place. You have a total imbalance of power. And what we need to do is to focus the struggle back into getting rid of that occupation by uniting all the Palestinian people in one struggle against the occupation. And that cannot take place under the nose of the occupation. If these people are sincere in their struggle against the occupation, they need to get out of Ramallah, dissolve this authority, go back to where the Palestinians are and start a real struggle and lend support to the steadfast struggle of the Palestinians under occupation. That's the only way, in my view, that needs to be dealt with. And the Palestinians will not be able not to bring about all kinds of creative ways to organize their lives, even if the occupation had to go back. That's my 2 cents on this. On the other, the question about international law, unfortunately, international law is what the powerful in this world dictates it to be. So if the US does not recognize, that's what, but we can change that, because I think we need to start talking about people power and try to impose people power throughout. And that's a struggle that's going to take, and we've seen it. We're seeing it right now in the Black Lives Matter and how things have been changing. But that needs a whole different revolutionary structure, and I think that's going to take place with the international solidarity movement, and we can impose, because at the end of the day, international law, yes, it has certain legal structures and aspects, but this will not be respected until there is a huge people power behind it.
I will just jump in and reinforce what was said on the question of, what can the government do? I agree completely. I think what I would add is that we can go back to the Palestinian National Assembly, and there has been campaigns to get re-elections of members of the Palestinian National Assembly, and to push in that direction for a reconstitution of the Palestinian National Assembly, and so that it can properly represent Palestinian voices in some of the same ways as in South Africa you had the African National Assembly. Exactly what was said is that to kind of bypass or dissolve this Palestinian Authority government, what have you. On the issue of international law, again, also agree. I think what's important is to think about international law as one tool we have. We need to think about all the different tools that we have. And so my question back is, what would you do? To the person who's asking. Actually, I think it was Awad whom I know, who we've discussed this before. But I think what would you do, right? How would you fight? And international law is a tool that we have. It's the best of the worst, if you will. And part of this is, how do we consolidate power in such a way to make international law work for us, right? There have been moments in history, recent history, where international law has worked for the oppressed, but it's a very big struggle, and it's not the only tool that we need to rely on. We have to rely on different methods. So in short, can international law liberate on its own? No, but it can be a tool in our arsenal of different tools that we can use.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sami Hermez and Dr. Arian. We have another question from Jawahir. She asked, how would you recommend tackling the normalization of Israel amid Zionist propaganda, both overt and subtle, that paints pro-Palestinians as radical, terrorists, conspiracy theories, etc.?
Well, when we talk about these charges of being radical, anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth, you have to address the issue from its roots. it's not a 1 minute answer, really. We have to bring about the history and explain to the people who are, because this is a propaganda tool. I mean, to label somebody in order to marginalize them and not allow them to speak by simply giving them these accusations, labeling them, and having them totally discredited. So what we have to do is to bring about who is actually is the terrorist here, who is under occupation, who is the victim. We have to bring the discussion back into its essence. Zionism has not only been unfair and oppressing Palestinians, but it has also been oppressing Judaism as a religion, because it has redefined Judaism in terms of great faith, one of the great faiths in this world, into an ethnic project, into a nationalist state. And I think that by itself is a disservice to Judaism. And to criticize Israel, meaning that you're criticizing Judaism, is by itself a phony argument that needs to be exposed. So this is not a one-line answer. We have to bring back the essence of this conflict. As I said, the roots of this problem comes from racist policies and history of European Jews by European communities and European governments. And they wanted to solve their Jewish problem and turn it into a Palestinian problem. While in essence, we say our history was the history of inclusiveness. Somebody like Bernard Lewis, who himself is a Zionist, but yet he's a historian, and he wrote a book, The Jews of Islam, in which he says that this was the golden age for Jews, where when they were expelled from Spain, when they were under Inquisition, when they were given the ultimatum of either convert to Christianity or being killed, or they have to be with forced immigration, the only communities that received them and they lived in peace and harmony was Muslim communities throughout, from Morocco all the way to Istanbul and beyond. So they were able to find these lands because Islam recognizes Judaism as a religion, as a revealed religion, and that they have all the rights and the privileges and as well as the duties to live in peace and security. Unlike Zionism, which came and redefined what Judaism means, and you can find also many rabbis who totally reject this notion of a Zionist nationalist state, the ingathering of Jews in Palestine for the purpose of establishing a state at the expense of the indigenous populations. There are many Jewish communities who reject that notion. And today we see many young Jews throughout campuses in the US and Europe and beyond, in which they reject this notion by defining or tying the faith of Judaism into the state of Israel. So we really have to explain this. And therefore, if you struggle against Zionism, if you criticize Israel, if you resist the occupation, it doesn't mean that you're anti-Semitic, absolutely not, and doesn't mean that you're against Judaism. We find many Jewish professors today and activists who totally reject this. They are good friends of ours. We never felt any hatred or rejection of them to us. I always tell people that you will find a Jewish Zionist and a Christian Zionist and a Muslim Zionist, and to them, all of them are enemies of peace. And I will find people who are of Jewish faith and Christian faith and Muslim faith who are against occupation. They will be my brothers. And I have a lot of Jewish brothers as well as sisters throughout this struggle. So we totally reject this accusation of anti-Semitism if you are anti-Zionism or anti-Israeli occupation.
I would say to add that you need people pressure. You need to build movements, mass movements, to combat this. It's about and it will take it takes pressure, right? These are long-held discourses. They're discourses that transform. The Arab was something else, and then he became something else, but he's always, he or she is always dehumanized. And so how do we combat this? It's about really working together locally, but also connecting globally with movements to put pressure in a very sort of concerted way, rather than operating on your own and thinking, you know, you're gonna change things in your workplace or just, you know, in your institution maybe, or you're just gonna talk to your friends about it. But no, actually doing something much more public and visible.
Thank you very much. There's also a question from Abhijit who's asking, do you think the situation for Palestinians will get better if the so-called liberal Zionists came to power in the future? So will a change in, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think liberal Zionists are going to come to power. I don't know even who is a liberal Zionist. Unfortunately, Zionism, by definition, means exclusivist state and exclusion of as many of the indigenous people, Palestinians, from the land as possible. On these two characteristics, all Zionists agree. They may differ on tactics, on timing, and things of that sort. And as I said today in Israel, we've seen, for example, the transformation of the Israeli body politics from having a party that dominated Israeli politics between 48 and 77. And after 77, the decline of the Mapai, or the Labor Party in Israel, now they only have like 2 or 3 seats, when the right today occupies about 52 seats. It's a huge imbalance. And even when somebody tried to present themselves as the center, there were 3 generals, Israeli generals, who were determined to quash or to crash the Palestinians through successive wars in the past 15 years or so. And we've seen what kind of politics they brought about. And they came together simply to unseat Netanyahu. Even on that goal, they were unsuccessful. And at the end, a lot of these splintered groups that came together under this banner of being blue and white, they disintegrated. So today, out of 30 plus seats that they had, they ended up with 19 joining the government. So you have today a government of 71 who are competing on who is going to be the best leader of Israel to implement Trump's plan. Even today, you know, believe it or not, even Netanyahu and his colleagues, the settler movements and the right wings parties, they rejected Trump plan. Even that plan, which was dictated by Netanyahu and produced and directed by him in the White House, he was there, you know, showing all kinds of thanks to Trump. Even that plan hasn't been embraced totally by his coalition partners. Today, the one who's actually always bringing about this plan is the blue and white, you know, Gantz and Ashkenazis and others, in order to pin Netanyahu to the plan, in order not even to think beyond the plan, because until today, no party that is part of the coalition with Netanyahu has uttered the word Palestinian state. They said this is not a state, doesn't have the conditions, the characteristics of a state. But if the Palestinians want to call it a state, let it be. So they don't say even a state. They are willing to do it on that score.
All right, so there's a few questions. There's like 2 questions regarding the BDS movement. So there's Muhammad that said, I have a question about BDS. It has been successful in confronting retail businesses that are invested in settlements, such as the case of SodaStream or Caterpillar. However, it has not been successful in facing up to Israel in the international arms market. What do you think that is the case? And there is another question that said, in addition to BDS, where should we focus our efforts to help? Where do you see pockets of hope and opportunity for the end of the occupation to become near?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So, you know, getting getting states to change their positions is, if you think changing the position of companies is difficult, then changing the position of states is going to be even more difficult. So it's natural that you're going to see companies, so some successes amongst companies, and some success, and you're going to see also a lot more successes in the cultural field and in the academic field. So you have thousands of faculty, especially in Europe and the US, who have come out publicly and supported BDS. You have many cultural figures, artists. Lord was one big name that comes to mind at the moment, that have spoken out in support of not, for example, attending talks in Israel or performing in Israel. And then you have companies. In fact, for example, G4S had said that they would start withdrawing their activities from Israel, but have yet to do that. And so this is why the pressure needs to continue. But then the next stage is going to be sanctions, or sort of arms trade and so on, which is a much bigger thing to crack. And you need to kind of build that level of support, the mass movement, the bodies behind you, right? The number of people to be able to put that pressure on government, to even have people in the corridors of power who have been elected and so on, who can also push from within. So this takes time. We forget that in South Africa, it took around 50 years, if not longer, I think. At least it took around 30 or 40 years for things for them to actually see some success in their boycott movement. With Palestine, it took 5 or 6 years to start seeing some major successes. So it's a long struggle. You can't think of, oh, I'm going to call for boycott today, and tomorrow they're going to hear my call. Because if you think like that, you might as well stay home and do nothing, right? And this is oftentimes the problem, is we think, oh, if I'm going to call for something and then tomorrow it's going to happen. If I call for a one-state solution, you tell me, oh, it's not possible. Of course, it's not possible on June 29, 2020, for sure. But if we need to think longer down the line, and work towards this, and put the goals and put the strategies in order to get there. And so the arms, going back to that question, the arms market, that wasn't the first thing that the BDS campaign worked on. It put out calls and said, we need to do this, but that's not where all the effort was going in. But in the last few years, there has been more of that work being done.
If I may just say a few words on the issue of what else can we do. I think I laid out, as I said earlier in a different presentation, that the survival of the Zionist state is tied to 12 different imperatives. Could be more, but that's what I came up with. And I think if we go and study them, the more these imperatives are weakened, or the more they go away, the weaker the occupation and the state and Zionism would be. And therefore, we need to study these and bring about strategies in order to weaken them and end them. And particularly, the first one, which I said, was exclusivism and exclusion. Today in the occupied territories, and by that I mean both Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and inside the 1948 areas, the number of Palestinians as of 2017 has exceeded the number of Jews. I think by few tens of thousands, and today it's probably even more. You have 6.5 on one hand, and the other one is probably 6.6 or something. So that by itself shows that this whole notion of building a state for Jews only is not sustainable, and it's not going to take place, because, and as many of these revisionist Zionists talk about missing the golden opportunity of exiling and deporting as many Palestinians out of the West Bank as possible. That hasn't come true after the 1948. Even in the Trump plan today, they talk about isolating or taking 300,000 from the Triangle area and adding them to the Palestinians, waiting for that historical opportunity. So how do we maintain this? That means we need to create organizations that will support the presence and existence of the Palestinians inside the occupied territories. We need to make sure that they will not leave. They will create all kinds of strategies and means by which they will pressure them to leave. We need to keep them in. This is how we can defeat Zionism, by keeping the Palestinians there and steadfast, particularly in Jerusalem and the West Bank at the moment. We also need part of this also to the delegitimization of Israel, because it is an illegitimate state that came upon a lie and myth, and that has to be exposed. And we cannot agree, we cannot buy the Zionist narrative. That is a false narrative. And we have to always fight this. And I've seen recently with this normalization, the embrace of Israel and the normalization process, is that they're trying basically to sell this Zionist narrative to the Arabs and Muslims and people at large. And we need to expose this narrative. This has nothing to do with historically with what actually happened. This is not the truth. And we have to start a counter movement in order to tell the people what the actual narrative is. So we need to support this, the international solidarity movement, particularly today in the country that is protecting Israel, in the United States. And we've seen this expanding, at least in the past decade. We need to break the unholy alliance that is taking place there. And we have to think of all different strategies of how we can do that, because the US today is the lifeline to Israel. And if the more this lifeline is weakened, the more it is cut off, the weaker this whole occupation would take place. And we should do that in all fields, at all spheres. We need to start movements within each country about how we can confront normalization. And I know living in an authoritarian society and in undemocratic societies, this brings its own challenges, but we have no choice but to embark onto these movements. I live in Turkey, for example, today. And the BDS, unfortunately, the BDS movement is not very strong. It hasn't been embraced by society. And Turkey today has the largest trade of any country outside the European Union and the United States. There has, between both sides, exports and imports, almost $4.5 billion. That's a lot of stuff. That needs, if we need to bring about the Turkish people who are very sympathetic to Palestine, to understand what that means and to take part into a movement to break this. That means there's a lot of work to be done. And I can say the same thing. And Sami has talked about, some of the things that are taking place within the Gulf. And we know that the people of the Gulf, generally speaking, are pro-Palestinian, and they reject this. We also see, politically speaking, Israel is with every separatist movement, with every movement that weakens Arab societies, with authoritarianism, the undemocratic regimes, and so on and so forth. So strengthening democratic movements across the region is going to, in the long term, pay off for our struggle, because the more we bring about democratic changes and transformations within the Arab world, within the regional structure, the more it's going to stand up to Israel. And we've seen that throughout the uprisings. They always were, the national flag and the Palestinian flag were hand in hand in every single capital where they rose for democracy, freedom, and and social justice and human dignity.
Yeah, can I also just jump back in, because I've also noticed that there's some questions that are sort of talking about negotiation and peace talks. And I think what we need to also recognize is that all of us who have grown up in the last 20 years or so have experienced the kind of media bombardment that has normalized the idea of Oslo and the idea of peace in our minds. And peace is something you generally you think about in the context of two different powers fighting a conflict that need to make peace with each other. You don't talk about, I would actually would like us to rethink what is meant by peace and what is being asked from Palestinians when we talk about peace. Because of course, people are gonna be like, oh, look, Sami doesn't want peace. Like he's such a, he's this crazy person who wants war. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you look historically, and we go to the United States of America, and you look at what a peace treaty, how a peace treaty is operated in the context of indigenous movements and indigenous land in the US, much land was expropriated from native populations under the guise of peace treaties. And so if we take that lesson and we bring it to Palestine, and we see when was the second largest expropriation of land after 1948, we see that happened after Oslo, not in 1967, but in 1993 is when the massive amounts of settlement building started to take place, and you have this now this situation. And so no, the struggle is not about, it's about putting pressure so that you can't make peace with your oppressor, right? You make peace with someone who you can negotiate with on equal grounds, on equal footing. But when George Floyd has a knee on his neck, he can't negotiate with the police, right? So you can't negotiate with your oppressor when they have their knee on your neck, and this is what we need to recognize, and we need to sort of rethink this idea that the goal is peace. Of course, yes, peace. We'd all love that, but the goal is the end of apartheid. The goal is the end of settler colonialism. That will hopefully bring you a just peace, and so on and so forth. But if you talk about this abstract peace, then you get us into the Oslo trap. And the Oslo trap is what I would suggest that we really need to rethink and get out of, because as much as we think that we are, fighting for Palestinian rights and so on, we inevitably, I would even say myself, fall into Oslo traps, because that's where we were, we grew up in this Oslo trap. One last thing remark I want to say, this is kind of looking back on my childhood. When I grew up, the word Israel in Kuwait, I grew up in Kuwait, the word Israel was always crossed out, it was blackened. And you no longer see that. In Qatar, I don't see that anymore. And what happened was they blackened it out, but they didn't educate us about it. So they blackened it out, and it was like, oh, well, if you black out the word, it doesn't mean the country is going to disappear. Of course not, right? What they didn't teach us was that when you cross out the word, it actually can start a conversation. That crossing out is delegitimizing. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. No one's saying that, right? But it starts a conversation. And now we don't have that conversation anymore. We didn't have it back then, and that was a problem back then. But in seeing this change now that's happened over the last 20 years or so, that line, the strike through, is a delegitimizing tactic. And if we could have that conversation over that strike, and reinsert that strike through, and have that conversation with Israel with a strike, then we can actually maybe even start to think about this differently. And this is not a question of censorship, right? It's a question of actually a conversation, to have that conversation, but have that conversation in a different way. Yeah.
I just want to quickly add something. I feel like, regarding Dr. Hermez talked about how we should try to denormalize Israeli and the Zionist agenda, the propaganda. And I think one of the important ways that we haven't really discussed is that we should not give the platform or any praise to anyone who spread Zionist ideas. I feel like when we give these people platform, and the issue right now, we have a lot of people who are misinformed about what's going on, and it's due to the Hezbollah Israeli propaganda foreign policy. And when we give praise or a platform to these people, not necessarily even Israelis but Zionists, and we have a lot of American Zionists, we give them the chance to spread these Zionist idea. And I think it's also really important to target this part or angle of say the BDS movement, not only boycotting institutions or corporations.
Zain, there was a question from someone in the comments about this question of deplatforming from Bassem, and I think it's important. He raises a good point. He said, my only contention is regarding deplatforming voices in the media. And I think this one's a hard one sometimes, especially in the media. And I think the idea again is that this conversation takes place in the U.S. with white supremacy. Do you put on white supremacists and to speak and so on? And the idea here is to also one, hold the line, two, that you have only so much space for people to speak, so much airtime. Why do you give that airtime to a view? We already know when putting a Palestinian Israeli spokesperson on TV that they're going to do a spin on things. So do we want to hear that spin? You can go to many other medias and hear that spin. Why do we need? What do we learn from that? Would we learn more by having someone come on and talk about the spin and debunk it, rather than, right? We already know those things. So I think it's important. This is the question. I mean, it's a larger conversation about the question of media objectivity and what media objectivity does that I had mentioned. But I think we really need to go after that. That not all views are created equal. Not all views, need to. I don't need to sort of present. I can't present all views. There's never only two sides. There's never only 3 or 4 sides. If you want to get into that game, we can go and, we need to bring 10 guests and so on. So this idea that, we need to hear 2 sides of the conversation. Well, why don't you bring, opposed to a Palestinian, why don't you bring an anti-Zionist Israeli or an anti-Zionist Jewish person and, who's not Israeli? That's another view, right, to the Palestinian one. So, I think that would be my kind of response to that, which is it's an excellent question. It's an important question to keep talking about.
And just a follow-up from all that we've been discussing, I'm seeing in the question a sort of passion and desperation. People are asking, what are some of the ways we can fight for Palestine from where we are right now? What are the ways in which we can educate those who are unaware about the situation as a whole and they are unwilling to understand and learn about it? So what can we do at an individual level? How can we contribute?
Well, I think education, we should start with education. And I would like actually to hear from the students, Zain and Maryam and yourself, what you could actually do on campuses. Maryam spoke about international law, how we can employ the information that we have in terms of what international law says about occupation and about occupied people in the Geneva Conventions and human rights law and so on and so forth, to educate the people around us. So we need to start with education and to make the issue of Palestine not an issue for the Palestinians. And I'm happy to see that, a lot of the people who are participating today, whether on the panel or as attendees, are not particularly Palestinians, because Palestine today is not a local issue. It's not an issue for the Palestinians. And Palestinians will not be able on their own to achieve justice and to achieve freedom and equality and self-determination. It's a struggle that's going to involve much more than the Palestinians or even the people in the region because of the nature of the conflict. So we need to start with education at all levels. It really breaks my heart when I hear from some people who should know better about some basic information that they have wrong. You know, it's the campaign of disinformation has been at full force for 70 years. You know, the fact that some people say that somehow Palestinians sold their land, for example, which is a total myth, because that didn't happen. And if we go and educate ourselves about the basic notion of what the nature of the conflict is, you know, talk about Zionism and the problem that existed when Zionism was founded and came about, and how the history of Jews in the Arab and Muslim lands, how they were treated. All that is a background that is very much needed. We need to understand the nature of the conflict. Yesterday, somebody sent me a clip from someone, I think from Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates, who was on TV arguing that the Palestinians, you know, basically the Zionist talking points, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, meaning that they always rejected peaceful offers, and which is a total myth. There was never in fact, it was the Palestinians who always brought about different peace initiatives, including the so-called Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. And before that, the King Fahd peace plan in '82. And before that, the Camp David and others and others and others. And most of this were rejected. I mean, we can go and discuss all the so-called peace plans for Palestine, which even we can go back before the foundation of the state, before it was founded, and you would see that it was the Zionists who always had this imperative that they need all of Palestine, and if not, if they can't get all of Palestine, then at least they can get as much of it as possible, dictating how the rest of Palestine would be under their control by direct or indirect means. So we need to start this education. We need to know more about the Palestinian issue, and that it is not an issue for Palestinians only. Then we need to move from that into not only educating ourselves, but educating others. And I think each one of us could become a sort of an ambassador, a sort of a teacher to others about Palestine. Then we move to the realm of action. We need to start thinking about what ways, what means we can employ, depending on what your community is, what your locality is. So if you live in a country where they have normalization process, then you start an effort, whether an official effort or unofficial effort, to break this normalization process. And you could be a lawyer, you could be a businessman, you could be an engineer, you could be an employee, you can be a teacher. Whatever profession you're in, you will find ways to resist that, because this is all part of a worldwide movement. In the same way that we were fighting apartheid in the 80s. You know, most of you are very young, you were not even born then. But that's how apartheid was dismantled. This is a movement that took over 50 years to fight, but it came about at one point where all these efforts coalesced together, and with a symbol like Mandela, people were able to break this system. And the last country that came around to do this was the United States. Reagan was the president at the time, and he was fighting until the very end. But at the very end, his vetoes against these laws in which apartheid was killed, they were able to override his veto, meaning that we have over 2/3 of American Congress who stood against apartheid. And that's when at the end they realized that they must end it. And that's how we should treat Zionism. Zionism is not a movement, and it's not a structure that you can live with, that we can live with. We have to get into our minds, into our psyche, that we cannot live with Zionism. We have to bring this information, this spirit, this education to the people, that at the end of the day, we need to dismantle Zionism. That does not mean killing Jews. It does not mean necessarily that all Jews will have to leave Palestine. We will find a way, a settlement by which this is going to be done in a peaceful way. But at the very end, in the same way apartheid was dismantled, this Zionist, racist, colonialist, settler mentality has to be defeated, and it has to be dismantled. This is the spirit we need to move on. And if we have this, then we can move forward as people living in everywhere. And at the end, there will be different venues. BDS is one of them. But BDS is a tactic. It's not, yeah, it's one of the tactics we can employ, and it's certainly effective, and it's threatening to the state. And as I said, when you go over the different things that we have to do, you'll find there's an overwhelming amount of action we can take, and you choose whatever suits you, whether it's in your own locality or whether you can join even an international effort, or we can do it through education or through action. But somehow we need to start this movement to move forward with the aim of dismantling Zionist institutions, because they are against human rights, they're against the rule of law, they're against human dignity, and this is what moral values dictate to us, that we need to start, that we need to have a system in Palestine that will be for all and not for some.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we're able to understand what is Zionism in this in this struggle, to know what we are up against, and to understand that being that the position that we are fighting from is a deeply anti-racist position, and being so being against Zionism has nothing to do with being against Jews or Judaism, right? Because they always try to get you into that kind of corner, and try to, so that somehow because you're criticizing Zionism or Israel, that you're anti-Semitic. And so it's really important to understand that Zionism is an ideology. Only 50 years ago, 60 years ago, what have you, it was actually a minority ideology within the Zionist, within the sort of Jewish political thought and the spectrum of political thought that existed. So what Israel has done is to kind of meld the two, Judaism and Zionism, in this way, and speak in the name of all Jews, and which is obviously really problematic, and one could even argue in itself as an anti-Semitic kind of act to speak in the name of all Jews. And so I think we really need to, and we don't have the time to get into all of that right now, but to educate ourselves on what is Zionism and how it came to be, and as a nationalist political thought. The other thing I think is that we need to fight cynicism, right? We've become many people, especially I see it a lot in classes, and as well, as that there's a lot of cynicism that this conflict has been going on for a long time. That we essentially keep losing. The situation keeps getting worse, and so there's nothing to be done. So let me just go do my thing, go take my classes and go home. Let me go just buy the new iPhone, whatever it is, and not trouble my head. And I think I'm translating here. But I think what we need to understand is the long history of struggles, not just in the case of Palestine, and so many different struggles. Just think of the anti-colonial struggle and the long the centuries of colonialism that people then freed themselves from. So we really need to have a long vision, and fight despite the losses, and despite failures, to continue to fight. That's actually when it's most necessary, is to be brave and to continue that fight even when you are being pushed down.
Yeah, and just to add on to what was said, coming from a student perspective, I think that we should start holding our institutions accountable for introducing us to like numbing us to such ideas. I mean, just last year we had 2 members of the Trump administration visit our campus, and it was it was treated as such a normal thing when it's not. They support terrible movements, so we should hold them accountable. And even the Alan Dershowitz situation, we should 100% hold our institutions accountable and not be numb to what we are introduced to.
Okay, thank you, Maryam. Thank you, Dr. Hermez and Dr. Arian. There's some, we have Hamad Shahada. He wants to ask a question. I'm gonna let him speak.
All right, everyone should be able to hear me right now, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Dr. Hermez, Dr. Al-Arian, I just want to say thank you very much for your views and for spending the time on this. I want to ask a question that we've discussed before in another club's event. How do you balance between the voices that call for no normalization, or at least that no dialogue, which I understand where that's coming from, the desperation of the engaging with negotiations with the occupation for the past 60 or 70 years, which led to nothing except more and more concessions from the Palestinian side, and the other voice that calls for playing the game of politics, basically. How do you balance these two? And looking at, and I think you referred to the Netflix series Foda, which clearly kind of puts in public, now I watched it to learn from it, it puts in public the occupation's strategy with the PLO and with the Palestinian so-called government. And the occupation chose to engage with the Palestinian government and kind of switch them to become incumbents in their own strategy and mission. So where are you on this equation, and where do you find that balance between the two? The question is addressed to both of you, if whoever wants to get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. I think the issue is not balance, because you always need to be balanced in your tactics. The issue here is we need to differentiate between principles and tactics. So if someone is embarked, what is the end goal here? If the end goal is a two-state solution, where you're going to give up 78% of your land and deny about close to 10, maybe 8 to 10 million Palestinians the right to go back to their countries. If that's the end goal, then certainly you're going to embark on a certain tactic, which the Palestinian Authority, which is fruitless. We've seen that because of the nature of Zionism and the nature of the struggle. But we need to identify our principles. What are the principles here, and what is the end goal? And then you need to say, what are the tactics, the means by which I can maintain my principles and at the same time achieve my goal. And in some instances, when you are weak, the so-called game of politics may not have to be played, because the game of politics is simply a reflection of the balance of power, geopolitical balance of power. And if you are weak, and here I don't define strength and weaknesses in simply military terms, it's much more than that. But if you are relatively weak to, with respect to your enemy, then that game is fruitless. And we can also take a lesson into the struggle in the apartheid regime. So you have to strengthen yourself. You have to gather as much power cards as possible in the struggle. And then you become a player in terms of being able to negotiate, not negotiate a compromise, but if we're ever going to be part of any negotiation process, it's going to be negotiation to end and dismantle Zionist institutions. In the same way, Mandela, when he was asked about getting to be part of a negotiation process, he refused. He was in prison, and yet he was powerful enough to be offered to sit on the table across the apartheid regimes, and he refused because he didn't want to negotiate how to keep apartheid system and make it look nice. What he wanted to negotiate is the end of the apartheid system. And we have to build our power enough in which they will come to beg you to come and to negotiate somehow how we end this thing. So I wouldn't embark into so-called game of politics. I will embark on building movements, because politicians are only reflection of their people. So if we do not change from the bottom up, from the grassroots action in which people start demanding change, the same way we see today in the streets of America. with the Black Lives Matter. We had a Black president, Obama. We had a Black Attorney General, Eric Holder, and followed by Loretta Lynch, the chief law enforcement officer, and this was a Black. We had a Black Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, all three Blacks, and they couldn't change the system. But today we may see vast changes because of the Black Lives Matter movement, in which it is spreading across the United States in dozens and dozens of cities, demanding the stop of police brutality, demanding the structural changes, and they are pushing very hard. And that's how power, that's how you get power. And then politicians will react to that power. And so today you have hundreds of monuments and bridges and schools and names of streets and so on and so forth being changed from the Confederacy, from these racist personalities because of that power, even though those who are in power and they have been there for years, they couldn't change a single name. So that's what we need to do. We need to concentrate now in how we can get power in the grassroots in order for the politicians and the decision makers to change, rather than go and trying to negotiate some sort of images of change. That's not going to get us anywhere.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Arian. I think you said it well, in the sense also that we need to think about what is our goal, and there is also a sense in which if you're looking for a two-state and I'm looking for one state, then we also internally have some issues, and so we really need to. Today in the Arab world, you're more likely to see a protest against Iran than you are against Israel, which is a real disaster. And actually, governments have worked on the grassroots to change this kind of thinking. I think there has become a lot of things that have really taken us steps back in the struggle. But if you think, for example, of the BDS movement, the BDS movement has clear goals and is working towards those goals in terms of ending the occupation, fighting for the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and the system of equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. It deals with the three sort of major categories of Palestinians, and the movement doesn't talk about statehood. And I think because there wasn't necessarily a consensus about that question of statehood then, and maybe even now. So part of this struggle is about creating a kind of consensus. Forget the BDS movement for a second, but thinking of a consensus and working towards this goal that Dr. Al-Arian is talking about is, how do we formulate that goal so that we can make that a platform and build a base and build solidarity and build an international movement around this goal that is more sort of formulated. I think these are important questions that then, because you can't, as you were saying, you can't play this game of politics if you don't have a leg to stand on, if you don't have a position, if you don't have a solid backing and a movement behind you, they'll eat you up. Right, so we're not even there yet. I think that the question of how do you play these balance these, you're not meant to balance them right now. You're meant to build pressure and continue building a movement.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to bounce back here, and do I have enough space to ask a follow-up question or not? So I'll wait for Zain, if she can tell me yes or no.
Actually, we don't have enough time. We're just going to take one more last question from the Q&As, and yeah.
Okay, then I'll thank both of you for answering the first question. I'll keep the second question maybe for a later conversation. Thank you both.
Okay, so as Zain said, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer all questions. Thank you all for your insightful questions. The last question for today will be, how likely is it for there to be many countries, whether Arab or Western, who will follow the response guidelines suggested by Al-Haq that you mentioned, referring to Dr. Hermez, or for countries to take any action at all against Israel's annexation?
Unfortunately, we have two examples from last year, and where the response was extremely weak or no response at all. We had the example of what happened on December 6, 2017, when Trump decided to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, in which many people said that this was a red line, and yet the response was extremely weak. We also had followed the following year, 2018, where he recognized the sovereignty over the Golan Heights, the annexation of the Golan Heights, and also there was hardly any response. There are reasons for that, and some of these reasons obviously have to do with the weakness of the Arab world, of the most of the, as Sami mentioned today, they have reoriented who the enemy is, especially after the 2011 Arab uprisings. We see today there is a sharp contrast between the regimes in which they think that their survival, that any democratic and popular movements threaten their survival, and therefore what they are trying to do is to preempt any kind of a democratic or movements towards democracy or movements toward popular representation in the region. And therefore they think that the only way they can do that is by allying themselves with foreign forces, particularly Israel. And I think through Israel, they can get the support of the United States. Many of them are, I think, misplaced trust into that process, but that's basically where they're coming from. And therefore, we really have to go back and think about the future of the region. What kind of region do we want? What kind of the future are we looking for? If we would like to maintain, if we are happy with the status quo, where the authoritarian regimes and corrupt regimes have the upper hand, where they ally themselves with Israel, where with Israel thinking and believing that they can dominate the politics of the region by leading the region, which is basically the core of Zionism, is that Zionism is a movement that is racist, and therefore they think of themselves like white supremacy in the US, above everyone else, and therefore everybody has to agree and follow them. So in that case, then we have to think about what kind of future do we want. If we want a future where human dignity and freedom and equality and democracy and rule of law and human rights are respected, then we need to work towards these goals. And the closer we are to these goals, that means this is totally against the Zionist idea and the Zionist ideology of dominating and putting a race above everyone else. The closer we are to Palestine, and these struggles go hand in hand. And that's going to be a struggle, a real struggle. But I think what we have seen, what we have witnessed in the streets, where millions of people were in the streets asking for these things. Yes, we have a setback now, and it has its own particular context, but that cannot continue forever. And therefore, we see the annexation plan today. They are extremely worried and pessimist about the future, and they think this is a historical opportunity for them to go and implement this. But I don't think they can get away with it, because for a simple reason, today Palestinians are not going anywhere. They're gonna stay there. So the more they do with these policies, the more apartheid is gonna be apparent to people. What we have today is an apartheid regime that has to be dismantled. If some people are looking the other way today, it cannot continue forever, because there is no solution. Zionism is not offering a solution. The ultimate solution for the extremist right-wing political movement in Israel is to expel all Palestinians from Palestine. That is not going to happen today. That's why the Jordanian regime, for example, today are extremely worried that Jordan is Palestine, is the replacement, and therefore this is where really, if the Palestinians want to state, that's Jordan. But I can tell you that Palestinians are not going anywhere. They're going to stay there, and they're going to contest and struggle and be steadfast and continue their resistance until they gain their rights. And I think with that, the whole movements across the world are going to stand with them. And with that, we're going to see changes on the ground. So I do not, even with all the calculation of the power of Israel and its allies today, that is not guaranteed to continue. In fact, I see the opposite. But I think it's going to be a difficult road ahead. It's going to be a struggle to to gain back the popular movements, to gain back the streets and change the political landscape in the Arab world and beyond. And when that happens, the end of Zionism would be certainly near. Thank you very much all, and I want to thank my colleagues here. I take the opportunity and thank Sami and Maryam and Zain and everyone else and Bothaina for giving us this opportunity and for speaking to the students. I always love speaking to the students because I think you are the future of our region. Thank you very much.
And I just want to have just one thing on this, what is likely. I just wanted to say that the world is not, a world where you can't imagine the impossible is not a world that I want to live in. We have to imagine the impossible, or the seemingly impossible. And so the question of, is it likely? What is likely? When the alternative is doing nothing, I'm going to make it likely. Right? I'm going to work to make it likely. I'm going to imagine it and work to make it happen. Ireland is one example where there's been a lot of movement and where things have been likely. If we expect the US to change on June 29 or June 30, it's not going to happen. But where we were when I started 20 years ago and where we are today is a very different landscape in terms of the popular support for Palestine. And you see that with new blood in Congress, for example, in the US, who are advocating and who are better able to advocate. And is it slow? Yes, it's slow. Can it be sort of feel hopeless at times? Of course, but those are the times when you have to try harder. So yeah, thank you also, Zain and Bothaina and Students for Justice in Palestine, and Maryam for organizing this and yeah, and inviting me.
Thank you all again for coming. Really, thank you, Dr. Hermez, Dr. Arian, and Maryam for joining us today. I can see that we still have a lot more questions that we're not able to answer, but I hope it was informative for everyone. I know I learned something personally for me today, and I hope everyone has learned something today as well. Also, thank you, Bothaina, for helping me out co-hosting today.
Of course, no, my pleasure. And thank you. I want to take the chance to also thank you, Dr. Hermez and Dr. Arian.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. Just to let everyone know, this session will be is recorded and will be uploaded soon on our Instagram and hopefully also YouTube. Yeah.